Chinese leadership is starting to target young seniors in an attempt to save the collapsing pension system. Pension changes are a hard sell for a government that conducts policy with a wrecking ball. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Chinese senior citizens are reportedly more sprightly than ever. They're traveling like never before, setting the stage for them to make up 50% of China's domestic travel by 2040. When they're not traveling, many are fond of dancing together outside, as well as exercising regularly, using all sorts of equipment and techniques. I can do that too, you know. I just don't feel like it right now. According to Chinese media, some senior citizens have even begun to engage in bizarre fitness trends like crawling on all fours, headbutting trees, and striking their groins with metal implements, reportedly as a way to enhance resilience and endurance. I'd love to read a follow-up piece about what sort of resilience and endurance can be gained by beating the groin with metal tools. In any case, there's recently been a lot of state media attention directed at the active lifestyles of Chinese seniors. And this added attention has been combined with a push for a new definition of seniors. In May, a Chinese economist and former official called for the country to adapt to the era of longevity by reclassifying people between the ages of 60 and 70 as the youthful elderly or young seniors, those between the ages of 70 and 80 as the moderately elderly, and those over the age of 80 as the elderly elderly. So does that mean 90-year-olds would be the elderly elderly? No, it takes too much time to say, and they don't have much time left. This new terminology was greeted with skepticism and confusion on Chinese social media. One user wrote on the social media platform Weibo, "The youthful elderly? Is that even Chinese? Because I don't recognize those word combinations." Another wrote, "My reading comprehension isn't very good. What on earth is he talking about?" It is confusing since youthful elderly is an oxymoron, like jumbo shrimp or effective communism. But some Chinese social media users quickly suspected what the new classifications were really about: pension reform. There is indeed a desperate need for change on the pension front because China's pension system is on the verge of collapse. Chinese state-run entities themselves see the state pension system running out of money by 2035 if reforms aren't implemented. And this guy on a pension ain't kicking the bucket anytime soon, unless kicking buckets is the type of exercise he does. Already about a third of all Chinese provinces are running pension deficits. So for many, it didn't come as a surprise when a Chinese news report followed up on the new senior citizen terminology with the incredibly unwieldy hashtag, "Experts say we must support the re-employment of elderly workers from ages 60 to 70. Then in July, the Chinese government took a big step down the same road with a published resolution saying that we will advance reform to gradually raise the statutory retirement age in a prudent and orderly manner. That essentially means that China will raise the official retirement age at some point in the near future. I'm not a fan of forcing people to keep working into their youthful twilight years, but if that's the case, then dibs on hiring this guy as my personal trainer and bodyguard. But while there might be a sense that a pension reform is needed, news of the resolution text was received with a lot of booing across Chinese online spaces. One Weibo user described the whole government setup of a retirement age increase as Chinese people being reduced to frogs that are slowly boiled alive. Another wrote, "Have you asked the public to weigh in? Serve the people is a joke of cosmic proportions." Well, communism is a joke, and it's the people who get the punchline. Obviously, such comments and many more like them were quickly deleted from the Chinese internet by censors. But before the posts were removed, a lot of Chinese netizens managed to point out that the Chinese Communist Party is talking about raising the retirement age at a time when youth unemployment is sky high in China. Maybe not the best move. If Chinese seniors will have to stay longer on the job market, that could make it even more difficult for young Chinese people to find a job. Some Chinese cities report that only 40% of new university graduates are finding employment. At the same time, many senior citizens are already struggling under the current pension system. According to my favorite state-run media, the Global Times, a Chinese survey found that nearly 70% of Chinese elderly intend to return to work after retirement. which is absolutely 100% the truth, not a gimmick to make the CCP's plan look better. Look, see, they were going to do it anyway. For real though, some seniors have talked openly about returning to work, saying that their pension simply isn't enough for them to make ends meet. And even though the Chinese authorities can boast of near universal pension coverage in China, under the current pension system, it's very unevenly distributed, with retired former urban salaried employees receiving an average monthly basic pension of about $470, while rural and migrant workers receive as little as $25. For China's nearly 300 million migrant workers, the low pension payouts mean that their primary source of pension funds will be what they're able to put aside themselves through their own work. But much of the work carried out by China's migrant workers is badly paid, leaving many of them in a situation where they have to continue working way past their 60s. And they are not exactly engaged in jobs that are gentle for seniors. Many migrants are construction workers, sanitation workers, porters, and couriers. So with a comfortable retirement already a far-fetched dream for both young and old in China, it's no wonder that there is strong opposition to pension changes that could make the situation even worse. In fact, pension-related cuts are so unpopular that in a country where the authorities crack down hard on protests and protesters, scores of Chinese seniors nonetheless took to the streets in protest last year in the cities of Dalian and Wuhan after the local governments cut medical benefits for retirees. Because what's the CCP gonna do? Imprison them? Thanks for the free housing and meals my pension can't afford. From an outside perspective, however, the Chinese aversion to pension reform, and particularly to raising the retirement age, can seem extreme, considering that the official retirement age is currently set at 60 for men, and 55 for female officials, and 50 for female workers. That means China has one of the lowest official retirement ages in the world, because it wouldn't be a story about China if it didn't involve cruelty and lack of foresight. And for many white-collar Chinese, it's not that they can retire at 60 or 55. Many companies force them to retire once they reach that age, even if they would prefer to keep working. On top of that, as I mentioned before, there are major disparities between government pension payouts depending on whether a retiree is registered in the wealthy urban municipalities of eastern China or in the poor rural municipalities in other parts of the country. Because rewarding the wealthy bourgeois and sticking it to the poor is what communist revolutions are all about, right? Right? So there is definitely plenty of room for improving the system, and decent ideas have actually already been proposed. It's been suggested to abolish the one-size-fits-all approach, respect individual preferences, and align the pension system with an increasingly diverse society. All that sounds great, and it's hard to imagine that Chinese people will oppose upgrades or sensible changes to the existing pension system, given how rigid and imbalanced it already is today. But there is a major problem underlying any government push toward large-scale pension reform. A major change is in no way open to any input from the millions of average Chinese people whose lives it could fundamentally change. It's probably best summed up by this Weibo user who wrote about the raising of retirement age. Shouldn't they ask the public what it thinks about such a big change? Or maybe put it to a vote? Now, obviously, China is not a democracy in any meaningful sense of the word. The CCP has made sure of that ever since it came to power. It kind of defeats the point of authoritarianism when you don't authoritarianate. I just realized I've never used that word as a verb before. Still, ever since Xi Jinping was appointed to the top leadership position in 2012, China has been moving further away from anything resembling democracy. More and more power has been centralized into his hands in recent years, turning decision-making on a national level into an increasingly opaque affair centered around the central leadership closest to Xi. Parallel to this, far-reaching policy decisions have been announced and implemented in the past with little transparency or warning. That means that new policies have sometimes struck wider Chinese society like lightning from a clear sky with devastating consequences. Take what happened to China's private tutoring industry. The $120 billion industry was hit hard when the Chinese government announced in July 2021 that for-profit tutoring would be barred in core subjects, a move that essentially outlawed most of the sector. This sudden regulation completely blindsided the industry, and it had a massive impact, since millions of people relied on the tutoring companies either for education or for employment. This is especially shocking because why wouldn't the CCP want a nation full of educated citizens capable of critical thinking? It's a mystery. Even more extreme was the implementation of China's infamous zero COVID policy, a signature policy of Xi Jinping since the pandemic began. The policy led to draconian lockdowns of China's urban centers, resulting in traumatic experiences for the urban population and allowing for senseless cruelty to become commonplace. For example, health workers in China killed pets while their owners were in quarantine. And COVID-positive babies and toddlers were separated from their parents and left unattended in hospital clinics. But hey, at least they prevented millions of people from dying, right? Right? On top of that, while the rest of the world abandoned the use of quarantines and lockdowns following large-scale vaccination rollouts, the Chinese government stubbornly held on to the zero-COVID policy, only to suddenly abandon it at the end of 2022. The sudden U-turn caught Chinese society completely off guard, and Chinese families soon found themselves scrambling to get elderly relatives out of the cities where infection rates surged out of control. In the middle of the chaos, the government declared a decisive victory over COVID. So with everything that's happened, it's not surprising that even Chinese people who support pension reform are on edge about what sort of life-changing retirement reforms are going to be sprung on them out of the blue in the near future. I think if I had been through the same sudden destructive policies that the Chinese people have been through in recent years, I would also think that maybe it's time to ask the Chinese public what it thinks about the next round of big changes, or maybe put it to a vote. Especially when it comes to something as fundamental as the reform of a country's pension system. Or, if I were a member of the youthful elderly, maybe I would invite fellow senior Xi Jinping to one of my workouts, so I could teach him how to vigorously strike his own groin with metal implements. You know, to enhance his resilience and his endurance. And now it's time for me to answer a question from a member of the China Uncensored 50 Cent Army. Fans who make this show possible by contributing on patreon.com/China Uncensored. Today's question comes from The Gunslinger. Do you think the persecution and neglect of its young people will lead to a crisis the CCP can't solve? With how generally dissatisfied the youth are, I can't imagine there being many of them willing to maintain the CCP apparatus once the old guard die out. Very good question, The Gunslinger. There's a lot of problem facing Chinese youth besides unemployment, like the fact that there are 30 million more men in China than women. So there is huge potential for unrest that could lead to the downfall of the CCP. However, I don't think the risk is that there won't be people to fill the seats of the current youthful elderly at the top of the party. A lot of those positions will be filled thanks to the power of nepotism. So the party will be able to hold on to the reins of power for many years to come, unless those reins are snatched away. Thanks for your question and your support of The Gunslinger. And join me on Patreon by clicking on that orange button. And here's a video I want to show you from my gaming channel about the just-released Warhammer Space Marine 2, the most anti-woke game you can imagine. Click here to... Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.